Hello, my name is Peter Christmas and I work for Quaker Social Action. I'm delighted to welcome Jennifer Kavanagh, who's here to speak to us today. Jennifer is an active Quaker and an author of both fiction and non-fiction books, and I'm going to be in conversation with Jennifer about her latest book, Let Me Take You by the Hand, which is all about life on the streets of London. So welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you.
Good to be here.
Thank you. We've got a number of questions, and the first one is about the process. So in your book you talk about lots of people making a living on the streets, London, and indeed living on the streets. So I wondered, when doing your research, how did you decide which areas to work in and who to try to speak to?
Well, the book is based on a Victorian book by Henry Mayhew called London Labour and the London Poor. And it was kind of the springboard for doing this book, because his book is absolutely extraordinary. Interviews with hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of people. He wrote 2 million words. As an investigative journalist at the time of Dickens. And it just came to me that in some ways, some things have not changed. And so the comparison with Mayhew was quite an important aspect of the book. And so right at the beginning, I made a list of categories of people, the sorts of people that he was talking to and their equivalent today. So there are the people who live on the streets, whom he called vagrants, the people and beggars, the people who are on the streets to try and make a living. So all sorts of people, and buskers and people selling food for people to take away, stall holders, people making things, extraordinary comparisons, similarities between then and now. So I had this sort of list of people that I wanted to talk to. And I started with the people that I knew. So I started with the street sweeper in my locality, who I've talked to often. And that was great. Actually, the very first interview was with a young woman who was working at a vegetable stall at Goose Street Station. And I was attracted by her because she had this call that sounded just like a Victorian street seller. Strawberries, 2 for £1. And so she was my first interviewee. And then she said, oh, you must talk to Pat, who sells gives away the Evening Standard outside Goose Street. And Pat was 88 and is an unbelievable guy. So sometimes one thing led to another. Sometimes I went specifically to a particular area because I wanted to cover the parts of London that Mayhew would know as London, which are the 12 inner boroughs. So I would try and cover those areas and go to the markets in the East End, go to the markets in the South London, and so on. Some people I found really hard to track down, like I was really keen to talk to a dustman, but they very rarely stop, so I was sort of running down the road trying to talk to this dustman.
Yeah. They're always moving quite fast.
Yes. Very often it was simply happenstance that I would see somebody, like a peanut seller or an apprentice gardener in Regent's Park, and I didn't have my recording equipment with me, and I would say, I'd love to do an interview with you, can I come back? So I would make an appointment to come back. We were paying £10 per interview for those that wanted. They didn't all accept it. Some grabbed it with both hands. Some people didn't want to speak to me. They were suspicious. They thought I might be some sort of authority figure that was, so I'm going to report them, and they didn't have a license. Yes, so sometimes I set up very deliberately like time out was given out on a Tuesday. So I would go to a tube station like Holborn and try and talk to someone giving out time out. Some people absolutely loved talking to me. particularly homeless people actually, who very often have not been able to tell their story to anybody else. And yes, I wanted a range of ages, of ethnicities, different nationalities. We didn't actually have to try hard at all, over 25 nationalities in the end. I say we because there were two people doing some work with me.
Oh, right.
One who used to be homeless, who has himself done shoplifting and drug dealing and therefore was able to access people that I couldn't. And he also did a couple of nighttime interviews, which I wasn't happy doing. Mm-hmm. And they both live in different areas and have different kinds of experience, music industry and that kind of thing. So, yes, that's the sort of process.
The process of writing the book and meeting all those people, did it change any of your views about any of the ways of making a living on the streets? Yes,
I mean, I've been volunteering with homeless people for many years, so the homelessness aspect didn't surprise me. But yes, talking to people who are trying to make a living on the streets, I think I was shocked really by how little people earn, sort of like £8 an hour in some cases, where there is no kind of security. People don't get paid, the sort of builders who don't get paid if it's raining because they can't work, don't get paid for holidays. The number of people who have to have two jobs in order to make ends meet. There was one Romanian guy I met as a living statue, absolutely amazing, and he was sort of in a triad. He was the second one up, and I held my the tape recorder up to him and interviewed him, and he's here in order to take a year out to earn enough money to continue his studies in Romania. But at night, and that's where he's supposedly earning his living, he works for Amazon. So he works for Amazon at night, and he does this by day. And then there are people like the window cleaner who gets on the 2:30 a.m. bus to come into London, because people have to live a long way out. They can't afford to live centrally. But I also discovered how much people loved working outside, many of them, and how proud they were of what they did. I mean, one guy who was painting the railings of one of the main squares in London, and he said, "This is listed," and he was so proud of it. And he said, "I never thought I'd be doing that." And it made me realise how patronising we are, how we imagine that jobs we don't want to do are rubbish jobs, when for many people they're not, and they're quite rewarding.
Yes, yeah. What you said about if it's raining, no building work, no pay, it really reminded me of maybe in Mayhew's day, people going to the docks to find out if there was any work that day.
Yes.
You talk in the book about high numbers of people who are affected by homelessness who have come from various big institutions, maybe prisons or the armed forces or the children's care system. Have you seen any evidence that those systems or any such systems are doing better to prepare people for life in the wider world?
The only one that seems to be changing is the armed forces, because the government is going to is saying that people who have left the services, if they're suffering from post-traumatic stress, they won't have to fulfil some of the criteria that other homeless people have to. And it seemed to me that was a sort of, if only they could see that as an option for all homeless people, that they don't have to prove their local connection, for instance. But the others, I've done a lot of work in prisons, which sort of specifically around homelessness prevention or attempts to, and it is quite shocking how little provision there is. And I've talked to somebody who's a chaplain in a prison at the moment, and apparently nothing's changed. I did look up some figures So analysis of Ministry of Justice data by the I newspapers found 12.8% of women leaving prison in the year 2020 to 2021, so really very recently, were released into homelessness, 12.8%. And Bronzefield, the biggest women's prison, found that 65% of women were being released without safe, sustainable accommodation to go to. And the Inspectorate of Prisons said staffing cuts had created weaknesses in release planning. Well, all I can say is it was so 10, 15 years ago when I was doing work on this. It just doesn't happen, and it absolutely has to. And as for the care system, that was probably the most shocking thing. I found so many of the homeless people I spoke to had been through the care system. I want to put inverted commas around care system. Care it is not. I mean, there's one guy who, lovely, lovely man, who used to sit outside Regent Street with a great big placard saying, "Your smile, you're wonderful," and other things, and then in tiny letters at the bottom, "donations appreciated" or something. And he smiled all the time. And I saw him one day when he wasn't smiling, and he was walking along the road, and I said, "What's up?" And he said, "It's my teeth," he said, "they're falling out." He said, "We were never told to clean our teeth." And the lack of education, people are illiterate, people coming out of care. One young woman who probably touched me more than anybody, she invited me into her tent. And she left care at 16. And she was in her 30s. She'd never had a job. She'd been homeless the entire time, lived off shoplifting mainly. So I don't think that anything much has changed in the care system. In fact, I read recently that, here we are, 1/3 of care leavers become homeless in the first 2 years immediately after they leave care. And the number of children in care at the moment is at an all-time high. 80,850 children are in care. And the more I think about it, the more I think government resources ought to be going into care of children, because so many of the problems arise at an early age.
Yeah.
You know, looking at the young men in prison, looking at the young people on the streets, that's when it all started.
Yeah.
And with more help earlier on, they would not be there. One guy in prison, I remember, said to me, "If your first memory was of your mother being abused, why wouldn't you be on drugs at 12?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it struck me when you said about an understanding, or perhaps a better understanding within the armed forces about PTSD. In those other settings are full of trauma as well, aren't they? And
Absolutely.
you just given an example.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't, from what you're saying, perhaps there isn't a read across of that understanding of trauma in those other settings.
Well, I think the government, they talk about our heroes when they're talking about the armed forces, and they don't have the same attitude to people in prison, or indeed to children. Yeah.
If we could talk now about the diversity of London, and I'm going to read for a moment a quote from the book. One of the many striking facts in the book is that in 1851, according to the census, 38% of Londoners were born outside the UK. In 2011, according to the census of that year, 37% of Greater Londoners were born outside the UK. So this disproves any suggestion that significant migration to the UK is a recent or post-World War II phenomenon. Thinking specifically about people within the asylum system, what evidence did you see about how well or not that system is functioning in with regard to preventing homelessness and destitution amongst those seeking asylum or who have been through the system?
I think this is the area that I'm most appalled by. I think it's the area which needs most attention, because the greatest destitution is among those who've come from other countries and who come here to claim asylum. They're not allowed to work. They don't get benefits. How are they supposed to live? I mean, it is complete destitution, and the whole system is broken. It takes years for someone to get their case heard, to get leave to remain, and so it is very shocking. So the Jesuit Refugee Service wrote, this is sort of a quote from the book, undocumented migrants are not allowed to work or drive or open a bank account or rent. Landlords can be imprisoned for not checking their status. 62% of refugees in the UK have been street homeless in the last year, and 47% of refugees do not have a regular place to live. And those are 2017 figures. So asylum seekers arriving in the UK are forced to live in accommodation provided by the National Asylum Support Service in what The Guardian on the 27th of October 2017 called squalid, unsafe slum housing conditions. Testimonies from asylum seekers and frontline workers detail accommodation that is infested with vermin, insecure, damp and dirty. So shocking. These are people who may have been tortured, may have been trafficked, have had to escape incredibly hard conditions in their home countries. And the other thing is that we detain them in detention centre. And in the UK, which is alone among European countries, I think, there is no time limit on that detention. And some people are held for years. And people in the day centres are absolutely terrified of being detained. I mean, they may have been imprisoned and tortured in their own countries. I mean, to repeat that for them is just so shocking. So, I mean, it's only charities that pick up the pieces and help.
So outside the formal system.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Another aspect in the book is about relationship breakdown, and you say that over 20 years of talking to rough sleepers, the cause of homelessness that I've most often heard cited is the breakdown of a relationship. And there are some harrowing examples within the book of how relationship breakdowns have led to homelessness and destitution. And I just wondered, from your wide experience working in forms of social work in this country and elsewhere in many different communities, have you seen evidence of or ways where support can be given within a community by a community to help to prevent homelessness?
Yes, we tend to think that it has to be outsiders, like social workers coming in and sorting it. But actually, I think that community is probably the most positive way of helping people. I mean, every situation, every relationship is different, so it's really hard to generalise. But for instance, I've been a microcredit practitioner helping women set up businesses, both in the East End, I did it here, and then, well, in fact, for Quaker Social Action, and then in 3 countries in Africa, in different villages. And one of the most important aspects of that is there has to be a common bond. They have to form a group of usually 5 women, and that group has to have a common bond, which may be that their children go to the same school, they may be living on the same estate, they may be in the same sewing circle or whatever. And those women support each other, and if one of them is ill or dies, the others take up responsibility for the loan. I've seen evidence in South Africa of people looking after children they term as AIDS orphans, where the parents have died and maybe the grandparents have had to take over. I think other countries are much better at living without relying on a nuclear family, that broader concepts of family, wider family, and also the saying, it takes a village to bring up a child. There's a sort of responsibility for your neighbours and looking after the children. I think we would benefit hugely if we listened to probably some of the people that have come from other countries and have that kind of view of how to live.
Yes, yeah. Thank you very much.
Yes, I also wanted to mention an organisation called Emmaus, which I think is quite a remarkable organisation in that it brings together homeless people and people who are not homeless in community. So without making that sort of stereotyping where we distance ourselves, where people live together, and homeless people are given the opportunity to earn a living, recycling furniture or learning skills that will help them move on, but living in community. And there's no, as far as I remember, there's no limit on how long they can stay.
Very interesting, thank you. Now, you explore various policy issues in the book that create homelessness or that have made people more vulnerable to homelessness, such as the removal of social security in the 1980s to people under 18, the loss of council housing, the growing gap between rent and benefits are all examples that you explore in the book. So based on what you learnt from meeting people affected by homelessness directly, what would you say are the areas of government policy that are most in most urgent need of attention?
I'm tempted to say, how long have you got? I'm not an expert on policy. It's not the kind of way I work. I simply talk to individuals, but my goodness, some issues do come up in a big way. I was incredibly shocked to discover that the Vagrancy Act, which I think was 1824, something like that, which criminalises begging and in an outside space and so on, is still in force. And delighted to hear about a year ago that the government was going to scrap it. Then discovered that they're not actually scrapping it, they're going to replace it. Yes, it's a crime to sleep in any deserted or unoccupied building or in the open air, can you imagine? Or under a tent or in any cart or wagon, not having any visible means of subsistence. So it's understood that replacement legislation will be included in the new police crime courts and sentencing bill, which I know a lot of people have been protesting about. As it currently stands, the bill already holds legislation that will continue to discriminate against rough sleepers. And Part 4 of the bill covers laws around unauthorised encampments, turning trespassing from a civil to a criminal offence, which directly targets Roma, Gypsy and traveller people and so on. And it will also affect rough sleepers, as well as the growing numbers of people who live in their cars. Let's not forget that people do. Yeah. So that's one. Scrap the Vagrancy Act. Increase affordable housing. Goodness knows how many years we've been saying this. Not increasing the right to buy, which is the current policy, which reduces the stock still further. People have to wait years for social housing. One positive thing that I heard is that the Church of England is starting up a housing association and trying to make more houses available to people. The next thing is universal credit, which is the benefit that is supposed to take over from the incredibly confusing and multiple benefits in the previous system. You know, a good idea to try and sort it out, but my goodness, universal credit isn't it. Firstly, you have to sign up online, and how many homeless people have access to going online? And there's a waiting time of at least 5 weeks before the first payment is made. And so some people fall into debt and have to resort to food banks, which are, as we know, on the increase. And advance payments, which are meant to help, actually increase the number of people in rent arrears, as people usually use it to pay for food and not rent and then have to pay it back. It's not working. It's absolutely not working. People are miserable on it. Reforming the asylum system, which I've talked about already, allowing asylum seekers to work would help everybody. You know, there are lots of jobs that we need filling, especially post-Brexit. A better inspectorate of hostels. 90% of the homelessness provision is hostels of varying kinds. Some have medium support, some have high support, so on and so forth. The stories, as you read in the book, of the conditions in many hostels, deeply shocking, full of violence, drugs. People are scared. I mean, the number of people over the years that I've heard say, I'd rather die on the streets than go into a hostel. People are scared. And I thought that people were perhaps exaggerating, but when I talked to some of the people, including people who are now have been through the system and come out the other end and are helping other people, talking of those experiences. So something's got to be done. There's got to be more resources. I mean, the problem for so many of these things is that councils don't have enough money to do the work. They are starved of resources, which are crucial to actually prevent the money that you have to use to mend the system. Prevention. Another problem is that the jumping through hoops that homeless people have to do when they're not in a position to do so. You know, they've got to prove a local connection. They've got to prove they're not intentionally homeless, and you know, all sorts of things are deemed making yourself intentionally homeless. You've got to be spotted 3 times, sleeping 3 times in the same place. People hide away. They're scared. They're not going to conform to these kinds of things. So the policy of housing first, which I think many people have heard of, which has been a huge success in Finland and Norway, where social workers help. I mean, they get housed first without any preconditions and then get helped with applications for social benefits and so on and so forth. Apparently, 4 out of 5 homeless people will be able to keep their flat for a long time with housing first and lead a more stable life. Now, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this famous everyone in policy, which actually was a sort of beginning of housing first policy. And I think did help quite a lot of people. But it did have its problems. There's a big issue, a homeless big issue seller that I've known for many, many years. And he told me before the pandemic that he was planning to stop. He said, I've done it for 12 years and I really ought to stop. And so I was really shocked to see him during the pandemic still there. And I said, what are you doing here? And he said, well, he has a dog who is the only being in his life that he's close to. He's had children, he's had to give them away, give them up. Broke up with his partner. But this dog he absolutely adores. And he said, if I'd gone into a hotel or anything, I'd have had to put her into kennels. And I couldn't do that. So that's just not thought through. I mean, just have some imagination. And it only operated during the first lockdown.
Yes.
It wasn't repeated. And there have been a whole lot of new homeless people as a result of the pandemic who have lost their jobs as chefs and kitchen workers and hotel workers and so on, have ended up on the streets. A whole swathe of new people, and they weren't helped by that at all. But there are, I noticed, there have been some pilot housing firsts in this country.
Yes.
You knew about that, did you?
Well, one in Luton I'm aware of.
Okay, Manchester, Liverpool and the West Midlands in 2017, and they're just beginning to evaluate them now.
Yes.
But there have been problems, partly because homes have had no furniture, delays in universal credit, and so on and so forth. Now, the one positive that I've come across is this new renters reform bill, because one of the major problems has been the private rental sector. It's been appalling. And people can be evicted for no fault at all. Landlords can just raise the rent without notice and so on. So the Renters Reform Bill plans to abolish the no-fault evictions and introduce a register of landlords, make it illegal for landlords and agents to refuse to rent properties to people who receive benefits. And they promise to bring it into law by the end of this year. It's being supported by Shelter. So that's a really positive thing. That really will help a lot of people.
You said at the start of that question that you're not a policy expert, but I think that it's only by knowing the experience of people affected by these issues that the issues become better understood. Next question. Your book includes a section on the homelessness industry, as you call it, homelessness industry, and at the end of which you mentioned some examples of peer-led approaches. In other words, services that are designed and delivered by people with lived experience of homelessness, of being affected by homelessness, and you've mentioned Emmaus as one example of community living. Are there other examples that you'd like to mention, that you can mention, that are of effective ways of addressing issues of homelessness?
Yes, because after all, this has been a problem for hundreds of years, and an awful lot of time and money and goodwill has been thrown at it, and very little has changed, and that's one of the upsetting things about it. But I've been very struck, particularly by an organisation called Groundswell, which is based in South London, where all the services are delivered by people with lived experience of homelessness. And the point is that they're trusted. They know what they're talking about. So people who otherwise might be wary of sharing their very vulnerable experiences know that they're talking to people who understand. I'll just read a bit from the book about Groundswell. It's changed the way in which homelessness services are delivered by using people with lived experience of homelessness to design and deliver those services. Peer advocates, peer researchers, and peer journalists are the engine of an organisation that prides itself on turning the shame felt by people who have been homeless into empowerment. And other organisations are now looking to Groundswell to inform and help design their own peer-led projects. So they are sharing their experience, which I think is enormously helpful. Another, in a way, a kind of offshoot is Pavement magazine, which is run by homeless people themselves largely. Most of the team are volunteers, and some of them, the journalists, have experience of homelessness, and graduates of the training courses delivered in partnership with Groundswell. So, they're working together. And it's a little free magazine that gives all the resources that homeless people can find. And rather differently, I could have mentioned it under the asylum question, is the Catholic Worker Farm, which is based just outside London, which is an extraordinary community of destitute asylum seeker women with volunteers. And the guy who runs it, Scott, said that from the moment he got married, he has always lived with homeless people. And they deliver all sorts of things, sort of practical things like food and accommodation and all those sorts of things, and access to legal advice. But most of all, it's a community, and the women of all different nationalities share the responsibilities for cooking and washing. They have a rota, and it's as near normal life as they can make it for people who've been through atrocious things. And there's a separate house for mothers and babies. And altogether, they look after about 20 women women and children at any time. And it is a farm, and they grow their own vegetables, including vegetables some of these women have never seen. They have an open day, which I normally go to. I missed it this year, where women produce most wonderful food from their different countries, and There's dancing and singing and bands playing, and it's all outside, and it's absolute delight. So it's a very powerful, very important organisation, one of the few that looks after women with no recourse to public funds.
In your book, you argue that deep social inequality within society is at the root of many of its troubles.
Yeah.
And at Quaker Social Action, we see plenty of evidence of systemic inequality. For example, people on low or variable incomes being unable to make ends meet, no matter how well they manage their money. Mm-hmm. Now, you know Quaker Social Action quite well. You used to work here. So do you think that quite a small organisation like Quaker Social Action can make an impact on inequality?
Well, you do, is the answer to that. Quaker Social Action has an extraordinarily good reputation. I've talked to people outside who say how very highly they rate it. I mean, I think the extraordinary thing about QSA is the way you spot a gap in the market, if you'd like to put it that way, needs on the ground that are not being met, which can be quite niche, quite small, but very specific, like funeral poverty, like people who got nowhere to cook, providing them with cooking utensils and a place to cook, like helping young adult carers. These are sections of people who are just not being helped, and it's enormously helpful to do this. And the fact that you now are spreading your good practice out into other parts of the country. I want to affirm Quaker Social Action as what started me on the path of doing the work that I've done and on this book being written, because I came to work here in the late 90s, first of all as a volunteer and then to work. I ran a community centre, and I did microcredit, as I mentioned, and understood for the first time the poverty that we have on our own doorsteps, because I think many of us feel that poverty is somewhere out there in other countries, but actually the poverty here is very real, and I think you do make a huge difference. The one thing, I wonder whether it would be possible to work with other organisations more. Maybe you do. I was particularly thinking about organisations that work on policy, like Roundtree Foundation and Trust for London and Citizens. I think then the link between the practical and the policy would be very, very well met, and it would have a huge influence.
That's certainly an aim, actually, because there are some organisations that do a lot of research and analysis, and so they have the big picture.
Yes.
In terms of statistics.
Yeah.
And we can complement that with case studies, more individual stories of how those issues are affecting people. So yes, that very much chimes with some of our thinking.
Yeah, so I'm not surprised. It's not exactly a new thought.
no, but it's a very valid one. So.
And I think it's great that you've merged with Quaker Homeless Action. It makes every sense that you're looking after that aspect of things as well. It's really good. And the QSA is not afraid to make hard choices, like shutting Home Store, which ran for so many years.
A final question, Jennifer, and you've mentioned the pandemic in some of the previous discussion, but what do you think has changed with regard to life on the streets, living and working as a result of the pandemic?
Well, this book, the research for it was done from December 2018 to March 2020, We finished the interviews just before the first lockdown. I was incredibly lucky. So it doesn't take into consideration what has changed. And so I haven't done any interviews or anything, but some things I've been aware of that have changed, both for good and for bad. For good, I think the delivery drivers who've now got so much more power than they had before because they're so needed, are beginning to flex their muscles a bit and strike and get better conditions. And Uber has announced it will guarantee its 70,000 UK drivers a minimum hourly wage, holiday pay and pensions. That's a big turn up, and I think will affect other organisations. On the negative side, Westminster is introducing stringent regulation of busking, which will stop quite a few of the buskers from earning any kind of living. And I mentioned about there being another wave of homelessness. So there seems to be sort of mixed views as to whether homelessness has gone up or down. I read one saying it's gone up, but actually the Chain, which is the organisation that does a lot of counting of numbers and so on, say it actually has gone down a bit. And maybe everyone in did have an impact, and we just have to hope so. The nationality profile has changed a bit, and Romanians remain the highest of other countries. And one thing I think has changed is people are more conscious of the inequalities. They're more conscious of people who are living hard lives. There seems more kindness around. I hope it's something that we can build on. I hope that's some hope for the future.
Well, what a fitting thought to end on. I'd like to thank you very much for your time and your insight today. And I'd also like to mention again your book, Let Me Take You by the Hand, which is available, and it's also available in paperback now. It's available easily found through the Friends House bookshop. We'll put some web links up on this film. And so it just remains for me to say again, thank you ever so much. It's been lovely talking to you, and I hope you'll come see us again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.